I tell you what, I'm excited to be here. You know, I raced against you just a little bit. You beat me. My pit guy says that's debatable, but I saw the pictures. I think you edged me out. But we're here with inducting this year, 2023 National Dirt Late Model Hall of Fame inductee Rick Egersdorf. How the heck have you been?
I've been real good. 10 years now since I've last piloted a race car on the racetrack, but you know, it's good.
And we got Dino Don Swearingen over here. Kind of, they've been running together for just a day or two.
Yeah, it's been a while. That's for sure. We got some history.
We brought him here because if he's not willing to tell some of the good stories, he will, right? So he'll bring them out. So he'll kind of get it out. So he'll kind of nudge Rick here a little bit. So, but I mean, I think this is more about, we got the Hawaiian going on. I got to ask, right? So I get here, right, and I get, hey, you have to wear a Hawaiian shirt. What is the story here? What's this all about?
Well, years ago, used to have to wear white pants in the pits, and not everybody but the big time racers had racing suits, fire suits, and that type of stuff. I was kind of reminded by Dino here that my brother used to race in one of these things. This is what he had, and he had an old purple hat that he wore, and we just thought we'd throw it way back to probably the early '70s, as this was cool, man, in them days. Not like today. You would never get caught dead up there in one of these. So, Dino, you got anything to add to that one?
No, not much, but you know, your big brother was, I certainly kind of idolized him, and you and I as competitors, you know, I think we kind of appreciated each other's abilities and so on, and raced each other fair throughout the years. But no, I'm glad we got to do the Hawaiian thing, and maybe Steve will be watching, and this is for you, Steve, as well as him.
I tell you what, I've seen Slammer at the track here, you know, in recent years, and I literally cannot picture him wearing a Hawaiian shirt, right? I picture him in a muscle shirt, rough and tumble, want to throw people around a little bit. Hawaiian shirt, that's a cool story. I wish he had some pictures from back in the day of him racing in that. Maybe he's got some laying around.
Yeah, he didn't keep hardly any pictures. The photographic memory was up to me, I guess, and I do have a bunch, but I don't think I came across one of them, but there might be one in there someplace.
So when you started racing, your number was?
Well, my racing cars, it was number 5, and that was a number from Pete Pecker from Hastings, and he was quitting racing, and so I asked him if I could use his number, because you couldn't have multiple. No one could have the same number in them days. They wouldn't let you do it. You know, not B's, C's, whatever. You had to have your own number. He was quitting, so I called up and I says, Pete, you're using that number. My dad actually made me do that. And I says, you quitting? He says, yep. So I says, can I use your number? Because I'd really like that number. And he says, yep. He says, do it proud. And that's the story of the 5. There's another story about the number 1 in go-karting too, so maybe we'll get to that one too.
We'll get to that in a second here. So from what I understand, okay, so Slammer was 3.
Yep.
And then Terry Lamphere was 4.
Yep.
You were 5.
Yep.
Who was 6?
A buddy of mine by the name of Tony Schomer that lived one block south of us, and he raced actually before I did, I believe. And he raced for a few years. He was an unbelievable mechanic and did well. He also raced in the soapbox derby, although didn't win. His little brother did, Mike. And Mike never raced cars.
And we got the oddball of the bunch here, right? It wasn't good enough to be 7.
Yeah,
you got to go 07, right?
Yeah.
Were you ever actually 7, or did you just automatically?
No, my
go
brother
to 07?
Tom was number 7. I always wanted number 7, and he didn't know what number he wanted to be, so I put number 7 on his car. I put it on with black electrical tape, and of course he kept it. But similar to asking somebody about a number, Dick Briesmeister was number 07, raced late models. He was just retiring, same time I'm coming on, and I didn't ask him, but I just took the number, and away it went, close enough to 7.
There you go. All right, that's kind of interesting. It was just right in a row. All buddies hung together. So Dino actually told me a little bit about, he says, ask him about his biggest career win. And he said it wasn't even in a race car. And you talked about the soapbox derby. So go back in time. This is before actually engines in cars, right? So
yep. Well, I got to go back a little further than the soapbox, because in Cub Scouts, that was in 1967. We had a large pack. I mean, Cub Scout packs were huge in them days, the baby boomer generations and stuff like that. And anyways, I raced a Pinewood Derby, which was just a little 6-inch car that everybody made themselves, and happened to win that. and that was in '67. So that was my first win with a trophy involved. That sucker sits right there, if you can see it up there. Pretty proud of that one. And then 3 years later, '69, I raced the soapbox derby. There's a little picture there. That was a worldwide competition. They had 250 kids from all over the world competing in that. And it was like the St. Paul would have their race. It was a gravity racing. It was a car that you rode in, and it was actually in Dino's neighborhood. And raced that one and won that in '69. There was probably 40, 50 competitors in St. Paul. And then if you won that, you got a trip to. First of all, main thing is we got $500 for that win.
Nice, nice.
Money's always important, but $500 in 1969 for an 11-year-old kid, that's some pretty healthy change right there. But then you got a trip to Akron, Ohio. They flew you out there, which most of the kids hadn't flown at that era in time. So they flew us out there, and you got to spend a week in a camp out there and then race in this international competition from kids from all over the United States and Canada and actually overseas as well. And I lost my first race by about 1 inch. In that one, had a fast enough time for 7th place, which at that time was worth probably about $1,500 because to win that was $7,500.
Wow!
So I mean, that at the time was a full college degree, basically.
Right. Back
then, it's got a little different nowadays. But yeah, that was my first really biggest proud moment as an 11-year-old.
So how did you actually get started in racing? Was it because your brother was racing? Was Dad involved?
No, my dad raced with people back probably just after his high school. He was involved with a car. But when they moved into the east side of Lake Phelan in St. Paul, up the street was a family by the name of Giles. Jim Giles, his car's right there. It's an old, what they called the super modified. And man, them were some crude race cars back then, but my dad and Steve and I all helped on that car. We'd walk up the alley at 6 o'clock because the races didn't even start till 7. Now you got to be at the races at 6 o'clock, so that's quite different. But anyways, my dad helped him, my brother helped him, Perry raced the car, and then after Steve was old enough, he raced a car, and then after I was old enough, I raced a car. So just out of that block, we had like 4 racers, just out of that race, just out of that little community there.
Wow, that's great. Now, was Perry his kid?
Yeah, Perry was his kid, and he was pretty successful too. Cody, his son, is now racing again,
okay.
So that's another generation that's gotten into it.
Right, I remember Perry Giles. What, 34? Was that?
32.
30. Okay.
32 junior. His dad was 32.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The good old days. So you come back to the numbers, right? So number 5 you started with, but you've had multiple numbers throughout the year. I was kind of looking at some pictures over here. I remember you in the early years as the 21, and then you had the 17, of course, the 63, the 91. Talk a little bit about a few of those different rides that you had along the way.
Well, I should probably start with, I was 5, and I raced in my own car. I was the owner for 2 years. And then I think my brother owned 1 year, and then I owned it again because I bought it from him. And then I decided I'm way too cheap to be a car owner. I got to figure out something different. And and that's when I wound up racing for Joe Jensen and Marv Olson in the 21 car. So that's one of the things when I was sold with a car to them to race, and that story is quite. I won't bore you with that one because that one's out there. But anyways, I was sold with a car to those guys to race, and I wanted to be 5, but they said, nope, got to be 21. Joe says he wanted to be 21, so I says, okay, I guess that I can get over that real quick, So, anyways, that's where the 21 came from.
And you ran quite a few cars in that, right? Of course, Joe Jensen, his sons both have had great racing careers. Joey Jensen, Brandon Jensen, both of them still winning races. Joe, of course, just recently, passed. I wish he was here to actually see this deal. We
got him here in spirit because I got his picture right there.
Absolutely.
But that's Joe Jensen, and he just passed away on Christmas Eve. And him and Debbie were big parts of my life, and it was very appreciated.
But I remember back one of my favorite classes. I'm a super stock guy at heart. I ran mods, I ran lates, but I remember you back, and I think they were called hobby stocks back then, right? So you ran the 21. Of course, you ran the 21 in modifieds. You ran the 21 in winged modifieds. I mean, so you ran a lot of years in that. Out of those 3 classes, any crazy stories that you have from those 3 classes in the 21 ride?
It's just, if you brought Joey up and Brandon, and it's kind of funny because when I first went over to Joe's house to race with those guys, there's new people, I didn't know who they were, and I said I would come over there once a week to help on the car, do setup or whatever, just kind of get them going in the right direction. Not that Joe wasn't pretty sharp already, but he was still pretty new at that time. But he learned from me, and he was a very quick study. He did well himself. But I can remember holding Joey Jensen sitting there while them guys were working on the car. That was my job, is to hold the kids. So if maybe Debbie wasn't there for some reason, or it was Joe's night to watch the kids. So that's kind of a fun little story.
As long as you're winning races, it didn't matter. And then that must have taken a while because you have a drawing here, that actually Joey Jensen drew a picture of you. So, he was like me back in the day, sitting there in class probably drawing pictures instead of studying.
Yeah.
I can relate, Joey. I kind of did the same thing. So, kind of a fun deal. That wing modified class, I remember growing up as a kid, going to the Cedar Lake Speedway. If Hibbing rained out, my dad raced in Hibbing. We'd run down and watch at Cedar. That class was awesome, and it had some very, very good racers in it. Who are some of the people that you competed with in that class that really stood out? Their careers were great.
Well, Jim Brueggemann, he was one that was in that class, and let's see, John Bystrick, he's passed away, but he was in that class, and Mike Kelly, which is certainly his dad was a motor builder. The problem was with him is always trying to outdo his motor because it was always big, and we had 406s, but he had bigger. But
anyways, Ron Jones.
Oh yeah, we got Ronnie Jones in there, which was a national competitor, but he was pretty much doing his thing nationally at that time. I think he was racing everywhere. And I know Ronnie had raced and had 63 or one. It was one short or one more than Dick Trickle.
Really?
For wins in a year. I know that, so that's kind of a fun story too.
63 wins in a year.
Wow. I think that's what Ronnie had. 62. That's what.
He'll correct us if we're wrong.
Yeah. I'm sure they'll give you a call. Yeah.
Where did you start racing? So obviously Cedar Lake is probably your bread and butter. You have a lot of laps around that place. But where was your first race at?
Well, my first laps in a car were actually at Princeton Speedway.
Okay.
And they had a practice day up there, and I went up there with my 56 Chevy and made a few laps. It was kind of wild because it's one of them, pictures in your mind. Barry Kettering went flying by me on the outside with his sprint car, and he was a pretty big name in sprint car racing in the whole Midwest area. And anyways, I got a few laps in. It wasn't a race. And then they had another practice down at on the asphalt track. But we went down there and put our dirt tires on and did a warm-up down there. And all them asphalt boys were so pissed at us because there was dirt falling off our cars all over the place. But we got a few laps in just to see what the cars were doing and shaking them down. But that was my first laps were at Princeton, but my first race was at Stillwater Speedway.
Okay.
It's defunct, but it was real close. It's not too far from right here. And so that was my first laps. And my first laps were, I think I was out there racing. I started in the back and got up to third and hit the wall.
But you were going forward right
Yes,
away.
I was.
Right
Yes,
away.
I
You already
was.
knew, I'm going to the front. And it was Checkers or Wreckers. Checkers won that night. Or Wreckers won that night.
Wreckers won that night, yeah. And I was so nervous. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to do it or not. I had go-kart raced and everything else and won in that. But still, when you get into a big car, you're racing adults. You're just a 16-year-old kid out there racing, and you wonder, am I going to get scared out of my pants and not be able to do this? Because we did have a friend that couldn't. So that scared me. So I was aware that it could happen, and I didn't have any problem, evidently, because I just mashed her down and got to third from the back. So
yeah, you've won a race or two since then.
One
or two. We'll talk about that. But what tracks then? From that point you got started. Stillwater Speedway was your first track.
Mm-hmm.
Over the early years of your career, did you have regular tracks you raced at weekly?
Yeah, we raced Sundays at Stillwater because it was close. Cedar Lake, of course. And Friday nights, I don't think we raced too many times until a little bit later. Well, for me anyway. And then North Star Speedway, I can't remember if they ran Fridays or Sundays. Do you remember, Dino?
Sunday nights.
Sunday nights, yeah. So some of that competition was separated between North Star Speedway, which is the old Twin City Speedway, and Stillwater Speedway in the early years.
When you think about racing in the upper Midwest, the Cedar Lake Speedway like stands on top as far as just a premier destination, just beautiful facility. Was it always that way?
Well, I don't think it was a beautiful facility, but it was probably the most competitive one around the five-state
really?
area, I think, anyway. Probably partial a little bit, but no, it had no wall around it. They had, I can remember in turn 3 and 4, there was a gully out there that had water in it, and if you went off the end of the track and you went down in that water, you were soaked, or you were always afraid of rolling over down there because cars would go off the end and they'd roll over. They'd give you a keg of beer in them days if you rolled over. But fortunately, I never got one of them in them days. But I can remember a few cars going over there and just it splashed the fans in the stands.
Really?
They'd be soaked with mud. But that was all part of it, man. That's audience participation, I always used to say.
And I've seen cars that have done that, and they come in the pits and they open the hood, and there's beer cans in the headers.
Yeah.
Was wedged in there because the fans would throw their beers into the swamp.
Yeah, that's true. There was nothing but beer cans in them swamp, and I did go off that end once, but I stopped before the water, so I was safe. But
Might have been a 07 that pushed you
might
off
have
the
been.
edge in there.
I would suspect.
Little payback.
Yeah, we won't get into all that. So your transition into late model racing. What was your first ever late model race? In which car?
It was probably what in the old days we ran limited late models or supers or hobby stocks. They all had the same name, kind of like, and that was a subframed car. And what we did was, that was the year I was running pretty well, and we would bolt these adapter plates on the spindles because you couldn't run the fancy aluminum ones that the late models ran in that class. And so we did that and put the big tires on, and I raced late models, I think, a couple times in the fall. And one of them that I remember that comes to mind, and maybe you guys remember this name or not, but I did that, and I was in the heat race, and I raced, and I beat Joe Merriweather. Now that was a big national name, and I remember coming in, and my brother said, "Do you know who you just beat?" I said, "Got no idea. All I know is I'm trying to get to the front." And it wasn't a win, but it was to make the show, and it was Joe Merriweather, which won the World 100, by the way, at one time.
Kidding.
And he was racing at Hibbing that year.
And that was a super stock, essentially, that you just put adapters on. So, I mean, things are a little different today. I mean, you're not going to put adapters onto a Wasota super stock and go compete with a late model.
No.
How much different were those cars?
Well, that was probably in the transition of the tubular race cars starting to be built. Most of them were probably subframe cars. Maybe there was a few guys that had tubular. They had rules around that too, where you couldn't have tubular front ends. You had to have subframes and stuff, and guys would take a tubular car and Mickey Mouse of subframes around them and try to get around the rules. There's a lot of rules infringements, so we might say, in them days.
I don't believe you.
No, you better, because that's the way it was.
I may have heard a story or two from my dad along the lines of that as well. So I remember, was Raleigh Foot's car, was that one of the first actual late models that you raced?
Yeah, I ran for 1 year with Olsen Brothers and Joe, and he didn't like racing late models. He liked racing the super stocks and the modified, and so he didn't have a lot to do with that one. But I did race some with that, but it wasn't a very well-funded situation. And not that Marvin didn't have it, but it was just, the car was just kind of just wasn't the best. And then Raleigh got a hold of me and said, "Do you want to race for me?" And that's how I started racing for him. And my first real late model invitational was one with Raleigh's car up at Superior. They had a big invitational up there, and I remember beating Rick Popovich kind of, and he was trying to get me on the bottom, and there was no way I was going to let him go there. He was going to have to get me on the outside if he was going to, and he didn't. So I was pretty happy about that one. So
you parked it in Victory Lane, your first actual invitational in that car. How many years did you drive for Raleigh?
Just one.
Just 1 year?
Just one, yeah. Raleigh was a unique guy, and he liked to have everything showroom perfect. I mean, had to measure out all the rivets so they were perfect. I mean, you can tell by the car of its era, it was even a pretty classy looking car. for its era, for sure. Nowadays, the guys do that just because they can buy a part A and put it on this part. It's all kind of cookie cutter stuff. Where in them days, it was all in your garage, and you kind of grabbed the component and made it work on your car. Is what it amounted to.
For sure. Now, is that so? After that, is that when you transitioned into the 17 ride?
Let's see. No, the next year I raced for Mike Kelly and Bill Brower, and raced for them for half a year. That was back in the old days of the wedge car, and the wedges were these monster tires on the back that had a sidewall that was just real wobbly, and I don't know if there was suspension stuff that you did to make them things work, because man, it was just you got on the gas with them things and you just hung on, because I mean, them things were so erratic. But I'll tell you what, there was a tire that they wouldn't lose their grip, and the monster motors just really dictated. That was kind of the transition from big blocks to small blocks too, right in that era, which had to be right around '84, I think, something around in there, and then got into the small blocks. But I raced for those guys for half a year, and it wasn't going well. And I remember hitting the wall down at Owatonna. And Brower was really frustrated with me as a driver, and so he never said that I wasn't going to race for him or anything, but he showed up at Cedar Lake the next week and said I wasn't driving the car, Ronnie Jones was, so that was the end of me as a late model team member. And then what happened was
kind of hurts, don't it?
Yes, it does. That's what happened to him in the 17. It really hurts. So anyways, you just kind of shake it off, and Bob Osterman had a late model at the time, and that's where the 17 started. Actually, Tom Neisches used to drive for him, and Tom had to be someplace else, and he asked me to drive the car. And I don't know if those two weren't getting along at the time or not, or what was happening. I can't remember. My sister married into the family even, so it must not have been that bad of a deal. But anyways, Bob had me race his car, and we went down to Casson, and I don't know if we won the Thunderbird down there, but I know it was a fairly big race, and he had me racing for him ever since. So, or I should say, not ever since. We raced to probably about '89. So 84 and a half to '89 I raced for Bob, and that's where we did a lot of the touring of the World of Outlaws and went all over the country before my daughter was born, Leah. So
you went to is that the car you went to the Dirt Track World Championship with then as well?
Not that particular car. It was probably the year or two later, because I think '87 is when I had my just phenomenal year. It was just unbelievable, and I went down there and raced and made the show, but then we had some motor problems. But we did go to the Kingsport once, and I remember that with a car, and Dino was down there too. That was the Race of Champions. He made the race, and I didn't, and I was so mad because you go down, to Tennessee that far away, and you expect to make it, and it just didn't work, and that happens in racing sometimes.
We were talking about that earlier. That was a true invitational.
Yes, you had to be invited to it.
So you were saying that in every track, right, there was representatives from a racetrack. Yeah. So did you both represent Cedar Lake, or
no? He represented somewhere else. Ron Jones and I represented Cedar Lake.
Okay.
I forgot who you'd maybe
Menominee. It might be that you guys wanted to go, so we just picked one.
I just remember what are the odds we go all the way down to Tennessee, and you start right in front of me. So. He loves my memory. He was 36th fastest. No, he was 16th fastest out of 260 cars. I was 36th fastest. And however you do the math, it's like, what are the odds I'm right behind Rick Egersdorf? It's like I travel all the way down here, and Lance Mathis was in our heat, but unfortunately for Rick, the car was set up tight and got a little piece of the wall right away, and, bad for him, good for me.
That was a high-back racetrack. That's kind of where Bloomquist started.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Well, I shouldn't say started, because Bloomquist actually started in California. But when he moved to Tennessee, that was their Cedar Lake, that Kingsport Speedway. It really was.
But I remember, like you said, I made it in the feature, because I want to tell this part of this story.
I bet he does.
This was one of the first guys to my trailer and shake my hand and say congratulations. I mean, Rick was a good sport. And I really appreciate it. It meant a lot to me. I mean, to think about it, they throw the green, he's in the wall. the race finishes, I make it. I finish third. That put me into the A main, which was a big deal.
Big deal.
The last NDRA race there ever was, and I'm in the feature, and he's not. And instead of him sitting his trailer pouting, he made sure he made it over to my trailer and shook my hand. So, do you remember that?
No, I really don't. But
well, it made an impression on me. So.
I can say I've done that in the past, because everybody works hard to do this stuff, and it was probably one of them deals where, we were all down there. You kind of meld a little bit when you go these invitationals, and that was kind of the big fun. Like Ryan was talking earlier about the old family spirit of racing, and it really was. I mean, the community that you had, buddies, you were in like a little pack of you had your little groups, your little cliques, we'll call them, of guys you really got along with, and it was a lot of fun back then.
You mentioned your dad. I was talking to Crash. You remember Crash from up in
yeah.
Proctor,
Crash
right?
Carlson, yeah.
Crash he's awesome. He's a Hall of Famer all by himself, right?
Oh, yeah.
And he talked about your dad. He said your dad was kind of a suit and tie guy, like spiffy looking.
Oh no, that wasn't my dad. He had a cigar hanging out of his mouth
and he never lit it.
And a monkey cap, and he never lit that. And when he got mad, that cigar might start like that long, and by the end of the argument, that he'd be yelling at people. That sucker'd be this long. So
was he a little high strung? Or?
He was protecting his kids. Let's say that, and if he didn't think something was right, he'd let everybody know about it.
Nice.
What if you didn't do well in a go-kart race? What did he do? Kind of get your attention?
Well, I had one time. It wasn't necessarily a go-kart race. It was a car race out at Florence Speedway, and I spun out on the last lap. And we were going home, and all of a sudden, at that time he drove the truck or whatever. I didn't even own one, I think, at that time. Driving home, and all of a sudden I get cuffed in the back of the head, and he says, "You ever drive like that again, I ain't helping you."
That's great. So he was passionate then.
Oh yeah, he was. That's coaching in the old days. Did that nowadays, he'd get thrown in jail, I suppose. When we were out on the track, you put that helmet on, you became a different person, and he certainly did. And it was just win. I mean, I was trying to think, any time prior to the first few years, if I didn't think I was going to go win out there, there was something wrong, because I always, that was my demeanor. I was going to go win, and no matter what, I'd dig deep or do whatever it took to win in my personality, I guess.
So with that said, because winning is a different mindset, it really is. Did you like winning more or hate losing more?
Oh boy, that's a question I never got asked before. But certainly with my record, I love to win. There's no question about that. But you're right. I think I hated getting beat. Quite frankly, anybody that beat me, I pretty much know their name. So you hope.
It's not a very long list.
Well, yeah, it is. But after 38 years, it was a pretty big list.
But you agree, you dwell on the losses more than you brag about the wins.
Yes.
And that's just nature of a racer.
So coming back throughout your career, right? Because who are some people that helped you? You talked about Joe Jensen. You talked about Geller. You talked about Osterman and Raleigh. Are there some other people that you're like, man, these people were really a big part of my career, whether it's sponsors or pit crew or...
Well, I mean, early sponsors like Viking Electric, which is a big conglomerate now. I mean, I often like to say that I was part of that, because they weren't big at that time, and to be a sponsored person, that got the name out there, got them started. But Viking Electric, Bargain Auto, Marv Olson was real big. He was, and Bob, he was heart and soul. Was it a sponsorship? No, he owned the car, and he worked his butt off in them old days to have the money to do it. He even spent money he didn't have.
Right.
Don't forget to mention a guy named Steve Egersdorf.
Well, yeah, there's Slam. I mean, fortunately, he was in my whole career, and I'll have to say that Craig, when Craig was the owner. And he listened to Slammer a couple of times, and they argued, and Craig would shake his head, "Oh, he gave me some bad information." But, Slammer was in racing for years and years, and, there's no way in my career it would have been as good without him as the setup man.
I agreed.
He understood it all so early, and he's still in it, and, still, as a matter of fact, he follows the national tour around still when it's in the warm climates, and And boy, he is another one. Some of these guys, they really did put their hearts and souls in it. And I always said that there's racers like myself. I can't even say I was 100% into it ever. I mean, maybe in the 80s I was, but those kind of guys, like, they are heart and soul. Bob was into it, everything they did is racing, and they bleed racing, and they still do, and it's like a sickness. They can't get it out of their system, and not that it's bad. It's a great community to be in. So, but I think there's a lot of sports that are that way. It just gets in your skin, and you can't break it, and it's a lot of fun.
It's a lifestyle. Is really what it is.
I think his point. I don't want to interrupt, but I like his point because Rick did everything else, the golfing and all the other stuff. He just happened to be a good racer too, and that's where his highlight all is. But I think the point he was trying to make is he didn't live it, eat it, sleep it, and wake up with it every day like other racers do. And that's a really good trait to have.
Right.
Diversity in your life, we'll say.
Well, I mean, you talk about. I look around, right? And I see sports stuff up. I see golf stuff up, right? So you talked about you played, softball or baseball together. You did some hockey stuff. Did you play other competitive sports growing up?
I played baseball growing up, and I was pretty good at it. And I remember as a sophomore, and that's how I got into racing. The cars actually was sophomore at Johnson High School, which was a great hockey school, by the way. I didn't play hockey not very well enough to even compete because I got my brother's size 12 skates, and you put them on a size 8 foot, it ain't gonna work.
Right.
And I know Hibbing has got a lot of good hockey players and stuff, but so hockey wasn't my thing. The coach had to put me in there once a game just because in the days that's what they had to do, and I felt sorry for him, and I was out there. But anyways, baseball was my thing, and played pretty good. Was a pretty good, was pretty big kid, so I was a pretty good home run hitter or whatever, and had a good arm, so I played third base. And played for Johnson, but I was hurt. I got a groin injury, and that's when I started racing because I was sitting there. It was a bad enough injury where I was on crutches, and my dad had found a race car. He knew that I wanted to race. This is when I was 15 years old, and said, I found this car. Do you want me to go buy it, and then you can pay me back on Monday? I'll go get it because I know you can't get it. Me and your brother will go get it. And I sat there and I thought, oh man, do I really want to go down this path or not? And, okay, that was my decision. So that's how I got into racing for, 38 years.
Tinker Tiller's car?
Yeah. It was, I don't even know, it was a 13 car. It was a car that had, basically we took the motor out at the rear end of tranny and threw the rest away and built my first race car.
Really?
It was good motor and good tranny and good rear end, the big truck rear ends that we ran in them days. And that's how I got into racing. So that was the end of my other sports, except like you ask about golf. Well, since 10 years ago, you got to find something to take your time, and I will warn people that golf is like racing. If you really get into it, it's a sickness too. You can get into this stuff and just want to, it beats you up, and there's one game you can't win either.
Right.
Because there's you just can't. No matter how good you are, you can always do better. And but that's a singular sport, so I got no one to blame on anything on golf except myself. And I can guarantee you, my excuse book in racing, there ain't no bigger book.
I think we can both relate to that. What do you think? I'm pretty sure. I remember as a kid, the first year that I really fell in love with racing. My dad raced for 20 plus years, and then in 82, Ron Jones drove for my dad in a super stock. And we'd make the trip up to the Riverview Raceway in Thunder Bay pretty much every Wednesday. And I know
wow.
You used to go up there at the end of the year for like the fall specials. I'm telling you what, my favorite memories as a kid was going to that place. It was crazy, the culture up there. Mm-hmm. What memories do you have from up there?
The exchange rate was always interesting because of the way Craig, if we won any money, and Dinah will know this, how he made the exchange work for him. So that was a memory. And then I did go up there with Raleigh Foot once, that was one of the memories where I did fairly well. I think we were like second and third, and I think they did 2 races at that time. Maybe, I don't know. It's in my records as 2 races, so it's like I didn't understand
Talk about the
that.
exchange rate again.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got to hear about that.
Sacks of quarters, Canadian quarters.
Mm-hmm.
So it took, we'll just say $1,000 made for the weekend. Stay an extra day, go to the bank and get $1,000 worth of quarters, Canadian quarters. Bring them back to the States. And unfortunately, a lot of customers maybe got Canadian quarters for change. In every car wash, because back then, before pressure washers at home, we'd go to the car wash, take the car off the trailer, and go there. And it took Canadian quarters. So you can spend $1,000 worth of quarters. You can. Is that money laundering?
I don't think so.
Yeah, because you're washing the car.
Yeah,
it's fine.
So either way, that's a true story.
See, Craig always had a loophole that he could figure out how to get out of. So washing the car was money laundering, but that was okay.
Now, spend another $200-300 in a hotel room for one more night, but then get it back with the quarters. I don't know how it went. But.
Right, because I remember. I mean, it was like what, 75. You get, if it was $1,000, you get like $750 if you actually cash the check. So you guys found a way to just get $1,000 for $1,000. That was.
They did.
Right.
Yeah, that was before my time.
Craig did.
Yeah, Craig wasn't going to let a buck out of his sight, no matter how it was. He knew how to farm a quarter out of anything.
So that place opened back up again. They got a new track up there, and
is it the same location?
No, different location. Yeah. But I'm telling you, they had to add grandstands for this coming season. They packed the place. I mean, I remember all them folks coming down for invitational season, Labor Day shootout, Northern Nationals, Wissota 100. They traveled well. And they drank. I mean, they drank a lot of beer, But they were a heck of a lot of fun.
Drinking beer,
right? Weird, right?
Huh.
Yeah, and then we all went to campgrounds up there and sat around fires and bullshit with everybody. I mean, again, maybe the rich guys went to the hotels, but we didn't. We stayed in the campground. Got
to have the culture. Who are some people that you personally, in your early years, kind of looked up to in racing, right?
Oh boy, when I first started racing, my dad took us to the racetrack when I was probably 8-9 years old. I maybe got, at that age, my brother got to go every weekend, but I got to go once in a while. That's probably why I got into baseball and some other sports where, Steve never did. But anyways, I mean, there's like, Jerry Rickard, USAC champion, and Ron Larson was another. Most of them were sprint car guys because that was the top. That was the chrome they had in their car. That was traveled, the midget drivers. I know Bill Surtz was a big racer, but that was probably a little bit before my time. But he was quite a racer too. And then with that haircut they called him, you had the three brothers. Yeah, you had Rick Lipinski, you had Itch and Scratch Daniels. Yep. Those guys were all big names in the big circuits around in the sprint car world. But then you had the late models too. I mean. And this is when I got to go a few times a year, was like Harold Mueller. He was probably the king when I was there, and they had these 16.5-inch wheels under their cars, one on each side, probably no stagger. It's like, I don't know how these guys drove these things or, whatever. They were huge. They grooved them so they looked like two tires on the back of their cars. And then Prusak, he was a big one. He was the one that had these megaphones on the side of his car, out the side of his number 66 he was. Yeah. And they were just, they'd go by and you'd just hurt your ears, but as a kid you thought that was cool.
Dave Adams was running back then.
Dave Adams and Morgan too. Dave Morgan
and Tim Lorenz. And who had the Corvette?
Amundsen.
Yeah.
Amundsen. Corvette was Dave Morgan.
500.
Yeah.
And Tim Lorenz was 9, and the Corvette. They raced Corvettes back then.
Yeah. Wow. Fiberglass everywhere.
Yeah.
They did have fiberglass bodies back in the day.
Terry had they actually molded them. They weren't actually.
Jim Underdahl.
Yeah.
That was Big Yeller, or no, that was Old Yeller, number 28, and then Dean Hobbs was Big Yeller. That was owned by the same. Anyway,
that was local. Yeah.
Well, how about moving through the ranks, right? Was there a couple drivers that you're like, man, I absolutely like. My greatest times in racing was competing against a couple different drivers.
Well, my greatest times, both love and hate, was Nesbitt. If you could beat him, I mean, he always, speaking of fights, he never really fought, but he was sure a mouthpiece. Boy, you didn't want to get in his way because he'd mouth you to death.
Did he get parked by him for years?
Oh yeah, right next door.
Right.
Yeah.
By that tree at Cedar Lake.
And Steve Arpin too, which really he used to come down all the time, and now he's the owner and the best chassis out there, one of the best chassis on the national tour with the the late model scene. And I don't know how that happened, but he was definitely a all-in type guy. But Nesbitt, he because he was a professional. If he wasn't good at it, he certainly wouldn't be able to do it as a professional for all the years he did it.
Right.
I always, Tommy was a competitor, and.
Would you say that's who you wanted to beat the most?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So you talked about everybody built their own stuff. Even when I was starting racing, we all built our own stuff and fixing stuff. And like half the time at the racetracks now, if somebody wrecked something or they hurt a motor, they just go home, right? I heard a story, or part of a story about like you guys just took an engine into a hotel room and rebuilt. What happened there?
I don't know. We were out on the road and probably had I'm pretty sure it was a cylinder head problem or something. And them days you actually brought a motor with you,
right?
Especially if you went on the road, whether it was a good one or not. But at least you could race. And I think it was Craig and Bob that actually did this, because I asked my brother if it was him, and he said no. He says, I rebuilt one down at Cannon Falls once, had the whole heads off down at Cannon Falls Speedway and put it back together, and that was back when Moyer was running, and I think Slam got second or third in the race. I know Mike Kelly was part of helping him out, putting that thing back together. I mean, a complete motor, and that was in the fall when it was snowing, because I know he tinted it because it was snowing.
Your daughter said you had one in a hotel room.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think that was Bob and Geller that did that, and I think Bob said, yeah, we took one in there once and did some head work before we could, because you didn't have them big haulers, so you didn't have a lot of places to work, and yeah, we changed motors at racetracks, many times. I don't want to say
right.
Thousands of times, but down at Sedalia, Missouri, I know that we changed the motor out down there between the heat and the feature, and we used these old trailers had tire racks on, and they had these poles that ran through them, and that's what kept you locked your tires on. Well, we used them poles, and we had 4 guys lifted the motor right out and onto the ground, and that's what we used. You didn't have time to call a wrecker over.
Right.
You did it with 4 guys, and that kind of thing. But I don't know where that hotel was, but I do know that did happen, where them guys brought the dang motor right into the room and worked on it, and it's like, wow.
That's classic. And I think back, I've changed motors at racetracks too, but that just does not happen anymore, which, again, it brings it back. I think maybe people were more passionate then, or maybe that the cost has gotten so far out of hand that they're having professionals build stuff now. It seems like there's less hands-on racers today than there was back then.
Well, I agree with that, and the other reason I think happened there too is there was such pride in track championships in the old days, and there was some monetary money involved.
Right.
At each track, not just on a national level. A national thing is so hard to win. I mean, you see like Sobransky and them guys racing 80, 70, and Giller, or that guy from Eau Claire area. How can you race that many times? It's like, it's not, that kind of thing I don't think is fair, because it's
right.
just, they used to do, like, they'd pick the top 30. Well, they'd still do 80, 90 shows because they'd throw a bunch out,
Right.
I always thought that take a snapshot, that's what you get. You don't get to throw them out for that, to make that stuff fair and stuff. But in them days, you changed motors to be able to do that.
Right.
And you change you had spare parts up to yin yang with you, and you had welders, and you had torches, and you did all that. Nowadays, you really don't see a lot of that happen.
No.
Well, it's pretty rare nowadays that you see somebody that can build their own stuff and finish top regularly.
Right.
They might pick one off here or there. So the time and the money and everything, excuse me, invested, you may as well have an engine builder build your engine. And, there's reputable ones out there. I'm not going to run a bunch of names, but we all know that. So as long as you're going to be there, you want that engine to be reliable and get you up front.
Right. Well, you talk about track championships, because you're right. I think that now today, nobody really races. I mean, I'm not going to say nobody, but very few people race for track championships. Nope. But I think weekly racing is struggling as a result. It seems like there's a so-called special somewhere every week, these little mini series and all that. Do you feel like weekly racing would be stronger if there was more of an emphasis financially put on winning track championships?
I really do, but there's a caveat to the negative side of that is it's really nice for these guys to be able to do a few things other than just racing too. I think it maybe helps keep a few families together. Where in them old days, man, you had to be at every race. It didn't matter if someone was getting married or other, you raced because you were committed to that. That's one of the things that I did, and maybe regretted a little bit in my whole career, is that when you committed to a guy to race for him, you were there. And if I was going to go to some guy's wedding, I wouldn't have ever had that opportunity to race for those guys. So it was always up to them to say whether or not we were going to race or not. But they felt the commitment to me too, so we wound up racing all the time.
But for every problem, there's a solution, and I agree wholeheartedly because I did the same thing. I missed my grandmother's 90th birthday party. They rented a big hall. Anyway, have a couple throwout days.
Right.
And that would solve, I think, a lot of it. And then maybe you would get, today if you win the track championship or if you're in the top 3 or 4 or 5, you look beyond that and it's like, well, those people weren't even there every night.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's an attendance record thing now, and it's just, there's some pride in that too. But there is a solution to that problem, and they just won't go to that throwout day.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think you're spot on. I agree with that. And I remember as a fan, growing up as a fan, like every fan base, every track had a fan base, right? So when you got to these postseason races, I call them postseason, Labor Day Shootout, Northern Nationals, Minnesota 100, the Punky, the fans in the crowd would be like, hey, that's one of our cars, right? Yeah. And you don't get that anymore. Like, hey, that's a Hibbing car right there, or that's a Cedar Lake car, that's a Menominee car, and with the lack of weekly racing, I think that's kind of hurt that. I think that culture is a huge deal.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's another piece of intrigue. The other thing that used to happen is it was in the St. Paul paper, the results.
Yep.
It just was the results, just with the name, and maybe we got a tiny article.
Yep.
But in smaller towns, they might do that a little bit more. But that kind of stuff is missing. And I always said Cedar Lake should publish it, even if they pay for it, because it instills interest. Why do you think baseball is such a prevalent sport? People can sit there and read them box scores. I never did that, but that's what these people do. They read all that stuff, and it's like, holy buckets.
Right.
And that's what creates the interest.
Yeah, and we're looking at some of the old magazines you had, right? I mean, or newspapers. You had the Hawkeye, right? And
Checkered flag.
Midwest.
Racing news.
Yep, all of that. And of course, with Soda Region, we've had all the dirt, which they've gone to an online format. Mm-hmm. But
Midwest Racing Connection.
Right. But that was such a big deal, that you look at that stuff, and it kind of gave you validation as a racer, right? It kind of made you feel a little bit more, good about what you're doing. There was even a show, I remember back, it must have been, I think it was the year that you just dominated the Labor Day Shootout with both cars. There was a racing show on TV at the time. I think it was on one of the local stations in the cities. The Race Shop sponsored it. I don't remember if you remember that ad, but I remember you being on that multiple times that year for a lot of wins. But that kind of stuff is so huge. Yeah. So when you look back at it, if you had it to do over again, right, would you do anything different?
Well, it would be pretty, I don't know. That's a tough question because I had a pretty good life with it. Marriages always are troubled with the amount of commitments that's made, and you always want to have that go. But, I know that there's a lot of trouble with that, and so.
Yeah, just the commitment side of things. How about for young people getting into the sport? Would there be any advice that you would give somebody that says, I'm looking at getting into racing? What advice would you give them?
Boy, that would have been a good one to think about a little bit. But, Here, I'll
segue it this way. Did you have any more fun running a late model than you did running, say, like a super stock or a modified? Or were they all fun to you?
They were all fun. There's no question about it, just to compete. And I mean, like I golf now, I love the competition, even if it's with yourself, as golf is. Competition with everybody. I mean, you can have a ball in any class you're in, I think. And you can go into it with what you can afford to. There's classes available. They might not pay anything, but you know, it isn't going to cost you as much either to compete. And if you like it, you just move up. That's one of the things I see, though, that I wish was more. I think in my area, you moved up in classes because you wanted to challenge the next guys, and so many people stay in the same class, and you know, some of them win and win and win and win in the same class, and it's like, no, move up a level.
Right.
If you keep winning in these entry level classes, you don't belong there anymore. And that's one of the things I don't like. But I also understand that that's what they can afford,
Right.
and that's what they do. It's because they're making a few bucks, and
Especially now, it
Yeah.
is so crazy
Yeah.
expensive now that it's even worse. Do you make it to the races very often anymore?
yeah, I go about 6-8 times a year. I do enjoy it when I go. I try to get to the opener because I like to see the cars all spiffied up and looking good because they do get dented throughout the year. And then I usually go to a couple of specials at Cedar Lake, the national stuff, because there's a couple of them that are still racing that I used to race against, so I kind of pull for them guys.
Right.